to our Life Stories Worldwide broadcast. Live story going out tonight on Life Stories Worldwide on social media. Tonight, we are going to share another powerful story. We share stories of all types of stories, types of sadness, happiness, joy, abuse, hurt, fulfillment, all types of stories from all around the world, going all over the world. If you want to contact us, we can be contacted on our website, lifestoriesworldwide.com. You will find resources there like our Life Stories app, which you can download from Apple or Android. You can also find a Gideon's Bible app, which will help in your own personal use. We welcome those especially from Ukraine who are watching today, and the people from Torch Trust. They can't see us, but they can hear us. And it's good to have you with us. And the rest of you joining us today, we welcome you all. So today we have a story from Trudy Makepeace. Trudy is based in Bristol. She lives in South Wales. Trudy is going to share her story, a story of abuse, hurt, but also a fulfillment she found in her life, a transformation that took place. She's going to be sharing about that today. So at this point, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Trudy. Trudy Makepeace. Thank you, Trudy.
Hi, Alan. Thank you, everybody. It's wonderful to be with you here today. As Alan has said, my name is Trudy, and it's my joy and privilege to be able just to share a little bit of my story in the hope that it will encourage somebody that is watching today. As Alan has mentioned, I'm going to be sharing that story with you. But just before I get into some of that story, I would just like to highlight something to you for your attention if you're interested, and that is I've just recently written and published my story in a book called Abused, Addicted, Free. I believe that Alan and the team will share that link with you if that's something that you may be interested in for yourself or for somebody else. So we just want to put that out there to you as well. I know it's a story that will encourage you and that will bring hope. And really, I felt led to put it in a book after the Lord spoke to me and said, now is the time for the book. Now it's time to write your story. And on the back of that, I'm really pleased to say that 2,000 copies have been distributed into prisons, and with over 80,000 prisoners in the UK, my heart really is to get that into the hands of every prisoner, because I know it's a story that will give them hope despite where they find themselves. So all that said, let me jump in and just begin to unpack some of my story with you. So 16 years ago, my life looked completely different to what it looks today. 16 years ago, I was a heroin addict, a crack cocaine addict. I had been an addict for 18 years of my life, and my life was a mess. I was completely broken. In fact, when people looked at me, they said, there is a hopeless case. She is a hopeless case. She will never make it. But I thank God today for his mercy and his grace that he had a different story for my life. And, I have discovered the author of life, who is able to rewrite our stories. And for me, like I said, if I was to probably go back to the beginning, because you may think, well, obviously she was in addiction. How did she end up in addiction? Well, the truth is, as a young girl, I grew up in a very broken home, a very dysfunctional home. And from the age of 4, I learned that I was adopted, so that I never knew who my biological father was, and I grew up with adopted parents, which was fine. But at the age of 4, when I found that out, and I remember sharing that news with my adopted mum, she responded in a way that was that silenced me quite violently and aggressively, and she walloped me to the other side of the room as I ran in and said, oh, I've got 2 mums, and at the age of 4, not really understanding. And when she walloped me and I landed the other side of the room, I remember as a 4-year-old thinking to myself, it's not safe to speak out. That's the lesson that I learned that day, that there was something wrong with me, that it wasn't safe to speak out because I might get hurt again. And so I learned that from very young, and I just began to wonder what was wrong with me. Why couldn't we talk about it? And then from the age of 5, I was sexually abused into my teenage years. But as a 5-year-old, I'd already had a fear of being able to speak out. I'd already had this fear that it wasn't safe to speak out. And now this was happening. That fear only intensified, and shame came to point the finger at me and say, something's wrong with you. You're the problem. It's your fault. And so from a very young age, I believed all kinds of lies about who I was, that I believed the lie that it was my fault, that I was bad on the inside, and this is why bad things were happening to me. And so that continued. And the more it happened, the more I believed the lie. So I grew up really believing all kinds of things that weren't true, like that I wasn't good enough, that I didn't fit, that I didn't belong, that I wasn't lovable, that I wasn't good enough, and all these things. And why that's so significant in my story is because it sets the backdrop for what was to come. And as a youngster, I found ways to shut down. So I started to find ways to escape the pain that was raging in my heart, and just that, not being able to escape the situation. And it wasn't just sexual abuse. There was all kinds of abuse going on in the home, physical, emotional. And so I just felt like a prisoner in that place. And the only way that I could escape was to try to shut off, or just to bury that stuff deep down. And from a teenager, I started running away. I ran off, and, I would try and run away to escape my situation. Eventually, I ended up in the care of social services after trying to take my life and failing to do that. And, the truth is, I just never stopped running. My whole life, I was running until eventually I ran into the arms of Jesus. But as a youngster, I was just running, just trying to escape my pain and my reality. But the truth is, it doesn't matter how far we run.
He's coming. Jesus is coming. I can't wait to hear the trumpet call. He's coming. Jesus is coming. And when he comes, we'll crown him Lord of all. And when he comes, we'll crown him Lord of all.
Or what we run to, or where we try to run to, we always take us with us. We can't outrun ourselves. And that was me. And very quickly I found acceptance and belonging, and in a crowd of people that were using drugs and committing crime. And really, I just wanted to belong. And, I found that here with this group of people. And, it's so important that everybody knows that they are loved, that they are accepted, and that they belong. It's a fundamental human need that we all have. And, for me, that's what I was looking for. And I found it, but I found it in the wrong places. And very quickly, I started to use drugs, soft drugs, just so that, to fit in, really. I wanted to be accepted, I wanted to fit in, I wanted to belong. And so that's what I did. And then I also had developed eating disorders because I had a self-loathing through the abuse that wasn't dealt with. And I was just a very mixed up, troubled young girl with a very low self-image and a poor self-image and a really low self-worth. And I started to look for love in the wrong places, and got involved in codependent relationships. And my drug use really just very quickly escalated and spiraled out of control. From a teenager, I started off on soft drugs, and I moved on to a drug that is known as amphetamines, and I was on that for 5 years. And they say after 5 years of using that you that you are clinically mad. And I can tell you, I wasn't far off that. I remember going to see my GP at the age of 18, and he took one look at me and he said, "Trudy, you are 18 years of problems. I'm referring you to a psychiatrist." And I thought, I'm not going to no psychiatrist. You're not putting no labels on me. And I remember just escaping that one. But the reality was I was very unwell. I was hearing voices. I was hallucinating. I was very unwell. I'd lost a lot of weight. But that didn't seem to deter me for the foreseeable future. Right up until the age of 33, I continued to use drugs, and my life continued to escalate out of control. And I committed crime, all kinds of crime, to fund my habit. And it wasn't long really before I found myself getting arrested and finding myself in prison on a regular basis. Getting arrested had become an occupational hazard for me. And so life was just really continually getting more and more out of control. And after a number of years of using amphetamines, I progressed onto heroin, like I said, and crack cocaine. And with that came a lot of violence, a lot of crime, and some very difficult situations. Eventually, I found myself working in brothels, in parlors, selling my body to try to make money. And you might look at me and say, well, why would you do that? Well, the truth was, I didn't know what it was to value myself in the first place. I had no concept of that. So it was no, it was no surprise really that that's where my life took me. And eventually I ended up standing on street corners as well, and selling my body on street corners. And my life hit a real low. I did that for a number of years. I ended up becoming street homeless, living on the streets for 6 years, surfing, from crack houses, drug dens, to the streets, to cars, to doorways, to sleeping under bridges. And it just seemed it was an endless vicious cycle. And I want to say, in that time, I had tried over 32 times to get clean. So within those 18 years, I had tried 32 times. I had tried different detoxes, different rehabs. I'd gone abroad. I tried a whole number of things to try to sort myself out and fix myself. I always believed one day I would fix me, that I could fix myself. And after 32 failed attempts, I'd lost all hope that my life could ever change, that I could change, and that was a place that I'd got to. And it's interesting, one of the things the Bible says is that when we lose hope, our hearts become sick. And I want to say my heart was very sick. I had become a prisoner to the pain of my past. I'd become a captive to the pain of my past, still carrying that around with me. And not only that, I had now become a prisoner to all kinds of sin in my life, particularly the sin of lying, stealing, and taking drugs. All of that now seemed to control my life. It didn't matter how hard I seemed to try to stop, I couldn't stop. It seemed that I had obsessed over my addiction for so long that it now possessed me, and it was impossible for me to get free. I could not get free. After 32 failed attempts, I realized I couldn't fix me anymore. And it just so happened around that time, I collapsed in a project on the streets in St. Paul's in Bristol. And it was a project run by the nuns. There were 3 nuns that lived there. Project gave out food to vulnerable people and just was there as a support to people in the community. And I remember collapsing on their doorstep one day, so sick from withdrawals. And I remember them scooping me up and taking me in and saying, come on, Trudy, you need to sort your life out. And, I remember they got me into a Christian rehab. They contacted a Christian rehab. Now, at the time, I didn't particularly want to go, but I ended up going into this Christian rehab. I was 5.5 stone. I was a mess. I was so sick. And I remember them literally carrying me into this rehab. And, up until that point, I never really knew anything about God. I guess I'd always believed there was a God out there somewhere, but I had no real concept of who he was or what he was like and how real he could be to me. And, at that time, I remember going in and I remember seeing all these people. They were joyful, they were happy, and they were drinking cups of tea and watching the news. And I remember looking at them thinking, my goodness, what planet are these people on? Because my life had been so out of control. And, it was far from normal.
Jesus is
Life Stories.
It was far from normal. And so when I saw people living a normal life, it seemed so abnormal to me. But I noticed there was something different about them. And I remember at that time, I didn't stay, but eventually I ended up back in this rehab, the same Christian rehab a number of years later. And I was taken to a meeting and I'd never been to a gospel meeting before. I didn't know what a gospel meeting was. And I remember being taken to a place in Cardiff, St. David's Hall. And there was a well-known man of God called Reinhard Bonnke, and he was going to be preaching the gospel that day. And I remember going in with the guys from the rehabilitation center, and I remember this man getting up and he just the minute he began to speak, he just captured my attention. His eyes glistened. He had this incredible smile, but he also spoke with this incredible authority. And he began to speak and he began to say, for God so loved the world that he gave his only son, that whosoever would believe on him would not perish but have everlasting life. And that, that God had demonstrated his love by sending Jesus to die in our place for the forgiveness of our wrongs. And, went on to say how Jesus had died a criminal's death on my behalf. Well, I knew what it was to be a criminal. I knew what it was to break the law, and I knew what it was to be punished for that. But here he was telling me that Jesus, that we had broken God's law, and he was saying, as he was going on, he was saying, that I was a sinner, that I needed God's forgiveness. Well, you didn't need to tell me I was a sinner. I knew I was a sinner. And that day I remember thinking, gosh, I need God's forgiveness. I need God's forgiveness in my life. I knew I had hurt people. I had done wrong things. I had said wrong things. And that day, he continued to talk about Jesus, and he said, how Jesus had died on the cross for us so that we could have a fresh start, a new beginning, that our records of wrongs could be wiped clean. And, I needed that day, and I wanted it that day. And I remember thinking, yeah, I need a fresh start. I need what this man is talking about today. And I remember going forward and receiving Jesus into my heart and my life that day. I remember they laid hands on me and they prayed for me in the name of Jesus. And I just felt this complete heat go through my body. And I remember just feeling like God was so close to me. And I remember leaving that place thinking my life will never, ever be the same again. And it was true. I had received salvation. I had received the gift of forgiveness of sins and Jesus into my life. However, on going back to the rehab, I remember getting a bit of money, a bit of a payout, and I remember the temptation that overcame me, and I was tempted, and I was drawn back to the old life. I was drawn back and tempted to go and score, to get a fix, and I did. I ran off from that rehab. I ended up going back to Bristol and using drugs. I ended up back in prison very quickly. And it was while I was in prison, I realized something was changing on the inside of me. I remember being in the prison with a cell with another girl, and with all the distractions stripped away. And it was when I was in the cell, I remember reading a calendar. There was a calendar on the wall with all these different Bible verses, and I remember reading them, and they just started to come alive in me, and I didn't really understand it, but I was really aware that God was with me, and that that something was changing on the inside of me, but I didn't have language for it at the time. But I just had this awareness of God. And the Christian rehab where I'd previously stayed found out I was there. They said, we will come to court, we will represent you, and why don't you come back and to the rehab? Well, I wasn't sure that I wanted to go back, because I wanted to be free. I didn't want to be confined, but I wasn't free because I was in a prison cell. Eventually, I thought this was probably the right thing to do, although it was a real challenge for me at the time, because a big part of me just wanted to go and use drugs again. But now that the Spirit of God was moving in my life, I knew I needed to go back. I knew that I needed. And so eventually I surrendered and I went back to the Christian rehab after the courts gave me permission to go back. And when I went to the court said, look, we'll give you 6 months to go back to this rehab to prove that you want to change, and we'll bring you back in 6 months for sentencing. And so that was it. I was back off to the rehab. And it was while I was there that somebody gave me a copy of the Father's Love Letter. And if you've never heard of the Father's Love Letter, you can Google that. You can type that into Google and that will come up for you. But the Father's Love Letter is a letter full of Bible verses that talk about God's love for us. And remember in the beginning, I told you I never knew my biological father. And so I'd always had this longing and this desire to know who my real father was. And it's so important to know whose you are. When you know whose you are, you know who you are. And I remember just always having this gap there and this desire. And so I remember as I read that letter, it started off saying, my child, I know everything about you. I know when you sit down, I know when you rise up, I know every hair that is numbered on your head. There's not a thought that you have had that I don't know about. And to paraphrase it, it went on to say, that God knew what I'd done. He knew who I'd done it with. He knew where I'd been, and he loved me anyway. And that he had sent Jesus to reconcile me, to reunite me to him, to him, to God, my Father, that Jesus had paid the price for my wrongs so that I could have this relationship. You know, when we do things wrong, we can't look people in the eye. You know, it's a challenge. And that's why so many people struggle with God, because deep down, they often feel not good enough, not worthy enough because of the wrong that they are aware that they've done. And I just remember reading this letter, and I just remember feeling like, wow, I just had this awareness that I had found the greatest Father, the perfect Father. It was like God was showing me through these words that he was my Father, that he loved me, that he loved me so much. And I just suddenly, as I read it, I felt, number one, I felt like I'd found the perfect Father. Number two, I felt like it was as though I'd come home.
He's coming. Jesus is coming. I can't wait to hear the trumpet call. He's coming. Jesus is coming. And when he comes, we'll